Greetings, my excellent friend.
Welcome to Most Excellent Adventure to
Heavy Metal
History.
All right, so my guest for this podcast episode, you may know him from his bands like Krallice, Behold the Arctopus, Dysrhythmia. He's also an audio engineer and mixer. Welcome, Colin Marston.
Thank you.
Yeah, man. So the thing I usually like to start with, but it's a bit of a cliche question, but, you know, I always like to know everybody's heavy metal history, so to speak. You know, those bands that kind of got you into the genre, interested you in playing guitar, whatever it may be. You know, what were those first records and bands that you remember hearing that kind of molded you into wanting to be involved in the genre?
Well, I think it's probably a pretty similar story to everybody else. It was Metallica.
Hell yeah.
And at my age, it was the Black Album was the new album when I sort of was starting to listen to music more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was kind of the entry point. And then my older brother's best friend had the Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Justice on CD. And I think there was, you know, I sort of overheard them talking about those records at one point, and I kind of got interested and borrowed the three of them from the friend and never gave them back and still have them. And so yeah, that was definitely the entry into metal. But I think it's maybe important or interesting to mention that I kind of wasn't that into metal or even distorted guitar when I first started playing music. I was actually like, I thought distorted guitar was stupid. Metallica was like the weird exception.
Yeah.
But I was much more interested in bands like Talking Heads and REM and bands that sort of like used a very clean guitar sound that were sort of influenced by funk and like, you know, Talking Heads to a certain degree African music, which I didn't really know at the time. So for me, it was like, I thought Nirvana was stupid when Nevermind came out. And it really took me a couple years to kind of like appreciate rock. Like I didn't like rock. I didn't like bluesy stuff. I didn't like pentatonic. I didn't like distorted guitar. I didn't like high pitched, singers, things like that. So now I can completely appreciate all that stuff. But for me, it was sort of, that was the entry. And then I got deep into King Crimson as a teenager and other 70s prog, but that was the main band. And that actually led to the sort of the more dissonant, complicated parts of that were the pieces of music that kind of led me to bands like Gorguts and Voivod and Cynic and Watchtower and Atheist and Confessor. And then those were actually kind of my entry into metal, oddly enough. So I kind of came through prog, then through technical, whatever you want to call it, metal, and then was sort of able to appreciate more traditional forms of death metal and black metal and heavy metal and so on.
It's funny, I can hear a lot of those influences throughout all of your music. And, also I agree with you 100% on the clean tone thing. If you can do it right, especially within the confines of heavy metal, I mean, there's nothing that sounds better than just like a perfectly clean tone. And it's also, I feel like it's really hard to achieve that because there can be many different like tones within that clean tone, if that makes sense.
Sure. And I think ultimately it wasn't even really the tone that I was attracted to. It was just the content. It was just the actual guitar playing, the actual music, the actual riffs. I think I just didn't have an ear for really heavy stuff yet. It just, I don't know, didn't make sense to me or whatever. I don't know, that's different because, something like listening to a Morbid Angel record is pretty different from Nirvana, but I wasn't interested in either. It was like the whole timbre, I guess, turned me off. And it took me a long time to appreciate metal production in general. I thought it was just the stupidest sound for so long. Just harsh and thin and like weak, all the things that everybody would say the opposite. Oh, it's big and thick and all that. Like to me, it was kind of the opposite. And I didn't even really like Black Sabbath much growing up because they had this very dry lack of low end in their production, and I was more attracted to like Led Zeppelin, even though musically maybe they were bluesier and so on. I just liked the sort of more natural, almost like, for lack of a better term, classical music recording style that they would use. And, you know, recording has been a big part of my life as well as making music. They've kind of been just linked my whole life. So those two things went hand in hand.
So what do you think it is about the early days of production that people maybe were not necessarily getting wrong, but weren't aware of yet, as far as like mixing death metal and metal in general, I guess?
I guess I want to like make sure that I don't think that it wasn't like people. I don't think it's the case that people didn't have it figured out and then got it figured out. Because honestly, now metal production annoys me way more. Modern metal production to me is the worst sounding recordings out there. Period. Like I can't stand the super triggered, sound replaced, ultra clean sound of today. So now it's at this point in my life, I actually really appreciate those Morris sound recordings in the Scott Burns production, which I didn't like growing up. But now to me, that sounds like a reasonable way for those bands to sound, because it's sort of it's the guitar tone that they use. I mean, the drums don't really sound like acoustic drums, but close enough. At least the kick drum doesn't sound like a kick drum, but the rest of the drums kind of sound like drums. They're over EQ'd and overdone, but in a way that lets the music speak. And, you know, ultimately, production can't really ruin good music. It doesn't matter how you record something. If the music is awesome, it's going to shine through. So, you know, for me, it was a struggle to kind of get into the production of the way the early Cynic stuff sounded. But once I could kind of get past that and appreciated the music, it didn't matter how it sounded. And now I can't imagine it being recorded any other way. When I imagine Focus or the demos being done with a clean modern style, I'm like, oh, that would be terrible. It needs to have a little bit of the dirt in there. But yeah, like I said, ultimately it's just the music matters. And I think a demo production or a full studio production can't really ruin excellent music.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those bands kind of somewhat benefited from the fact that they were all kind of experimenting. You know, I don't think a lot of these guys even really knew what to do with heavy metal in general, because I think a lot of them were used to mixing, you know, rock and alternative bands at that time.
Sure. I mean, that is a big part of it. It was their sort of the experimental stages of maybe extreme metal itself, and then also how it could sound. And now we have all these different established ways that extreme music tends to be produced. There's many threads that you can follow till now. And, you know, and it's cool that like the style of recording that I gravitate more towards, which is the sort of more classic rock, naturalistic, roomy kind of way of recording, that has a whole thread in metal. And, you know, people like Billy Anderson have kind of been making records that way for a really long time. And then, you know, eventually Steve Albini started recording some metal bands. And so they kind of have a little bit of that atmosphere. And then there's all the people that are influenced by that recording style, pushing it. So there are those recordings of metal now that are, you know, more like the ones that I grew up liking. And that is a whole thread that exists now, which is cool. But like I said, too, I can also appreciate the more synthetic, imaginary styles of recording now, too, just with a little more age and perspective.
Yeah, so that's something I was, you know, curious about. And one of the reasons that I wanted you on was, you know, how do you approach recording and mixing and everything that you do in your studio, and how has that kind of evolved over time since you started?
Well, I guess that's pretty broad question, but along the lines of what I've been saying, I mean, I was attracted to this sort of more straightforward style of recording. So I've kind of spent a long time practicing getting that to work with extreme metal, and maybe that's something that makes me sort of unique in a sense. I'm not sure. It's hard to have perspective on that.
Yeah.
But you know, that was definitely the thing that I gravitated towards. So that informed a lot of my early recordings, and still to this day. I think now that I have a little bit more of an appreciation for these different, basically now I just feel like there's nothing that automatically sounds bad. Like anything can work. Even a sound that is bad, quote unquote, can be awesome in the right context. Everything is contextual. So at this point, I'm just a little more open to experimenting, recording any guitar sound, any snare drum. It doesn't matter. I'm happy to kind of like go with the flow of what the band wants. Always. I mean, I think that's important. I've always kind of thought that, but maybe in the past I had like more specific ideas about what guitar tone I liked or what snare drum sound I liked. And at this point now, I just feel like recording enough records, that's kind of gone out the window. I feel like something that I didn't think I could appreciate, maybe I recorded that sound a few times, and now I sort of have figured out a way to appreciate it, so I'm not turned off by it anymore. So I think the variety of sounds or approaches in my recordings have maybe just gotten more varied as time has gone.
Yeah. Now, do you keep a good mix of like analog and digital, or are you all digital?
So I guess as of, when was it? About 2013, I've been all digital.
Okay.
Before that, I was mostly doing a hybrid of doing all the basic tracking to 2-inch tape.
Wow.
And then I would dump the multi-track into a computer. It used to be Pro Tools, and I've been using Logic for the last 11 years or something.
Okay.
And then I would do overdubs and mixing in the computer always. And I really have always preferred the mixing in a computer. My earliest recordings, which were done on cassette 4-track, were obviously just mixed off of the 4-track. But once I started using computers and mixing with automation, and being able to work on a mix and then put it away and come back to it at any point in time, and it's exactly the same as where you left off, has been a huge advantage. And in terms of practicality, it's necessary for me to mix that way, because otherwise I couldn't work on multiple albums at the same time. And I have to be able to do that just to make enough money to keep the studio open. There's no way I could just work on one album at a time and stay alive.
Yeah.
And make all the records for my own bands that I want to, and demos and so on.
So one thing that I obviously I like to kind of touch on is histories of records. And there's a record that you worked on. I don't know how much you'll remember working on it, or it's an EP actually. It's the Gangastron EP.
Oh yeah,
that it's got like a 15th anniversary. It's probably one of those records that I remember that like changed my way of thinking of what music and heavy metal could kind of be like, because the fusion of those two different things. What do you remember about working on that record with them?
I have fond memories of it for sure. That was actually done at my old studio that I was only in for a couple of years, Pain Cave, in Brooklyn, which was just a sort of a small basement studio before I moved into where I am now. And yeah, so it's interesting because I only had that studio for 2 years, and I've had this studio now for 14, and it oddly seemed like I have as many memories from the old studio as I do from the new one. It's funny how time can get kind of squished like that. But yeah, they were guys that I met playing Behold the Arctopus shows. I think we played a show together where a couple of them went to college up at Vassar, and maybe met them that way. And then it also turned out later that Michael, the keyboardist, was a old high school friend of Mick Master and Lev from Krallice.
Oh wow!
Who I had actually met them before, but I met them separately, and then they just happened to know each other, which was interesting. But yeah, the memories of that session were just that it was a lot of fun, and I have maybe I don't know if this is negative or not, but like I do remember them trying to overdub a theremin part for hours, and that not being as easy as I wanted it to. But it's on the record. Oh, I also have a distinct memory of they wanted to use this sample from, I think it was one of those TV Carnage comps where they just edit together lots of scenes of horror movies, and it's just an overload. I think it was from that. It might have been something else, but they were worried about using the sample and getting in trouble, so they just had Mookie say the sample, and then we EQ'd it to sound like a sample. So we made a fake sample.
Oh man, do you know what one it was? It's been a minute since I've listened to that record, but
it's like the guitarist drop out and he goes, this music sounds really good.
Oh shit. That's crazy. Okay.
So that's actually just Mookie, I think, imitating the sample that they wanted to use. They might have even changed the words. I think it's the same wording. I mean, it was a long time ago, but
yeah.
that was a memory that was associated with much laughter.
You know, man, I bet they could have got away with it because those TV Carnage things are like free reign, basically. I've seen those things.
Yeah,
so many
and
times.
you know, I don't know, the whole sampling rule rules are pretty arbitrary. There's, Mortician's entire career is based on horror movie samples, and then I remember at a certain point, Relapse Records got really nervous about copyright infringement issues, and for a while in that old studio, they were hiring me to take one of their new releases and remove all the samples, like edit them out. So I remember spending hours going through a Bongzilla record, editing out all the South Park samples so Relapse wouldn't get sued.
Man, I feel like that's still kind of a weird gray area in music. Because you still hear bands do it, but you never hear any stories of like, oh man, we got sued for using that one little 2-second clip. But I guess it's kind of a chance you got to take if you want to use the clip for whatever impact it may or may not have on the music, whether it's for comedic purposes or otherwise. So there's certain labels that just play it absolutely safe, and others where they're like, well, no one's gonna sue Willow Tip or whatever. Yeah. Man, that's crazy. Yeah, that's so cool that you've worked on like a ton of like really awesome kind of game-changing records, I feel like. And not only that, like a lot of the bands all the bands that you've been in, I would say, are kind of game-changing, so to speak, because I feel like when Dysrhythmia started, there wasn't a whole lot of those kind of metal or even like heavier bands that were playing just instrumental music outside of like those virtuoso guitar players. Whereas now I feel like that's, it's just run rampant. There's so many like just guitar player, just bass player, drummer kind of bands with no vocals. And, I feel like you guys were kind of at the forefront of that back then. And when you and Kevin were kind of starting that, like, was it something that you took notice of, that there wasn't anybody doing anything like that? Or was it just kind of like, hey, we don't want a vocalist, or, how did that kind of start?
But I did start Behold the Arctopus only a couple years after Dysrhythmia started with the same basic template. So definitely was in the same headspace of wanting to make sort of metallic instrumental stuff. But I think it really depends on how you classify the music, because if you're just talking metal, if it has to be metal that we're talking about, then I think you're right. The instrumental metal tended to be more of those stupid shredder records, which I never had any interest in growing up. Kevin and Mike Lerner and stuff got into some of those, the Yngwie and Satriani and Vai and stuff, but I always thought that was the cheesiest shit ever growing up. Now, and it's like I said, now I can kind of appreciate it, but no interest in it back in the day. But what I did grow up with was prog and classical. And in those types of music, instrumental is practically more normal than vocal music. It's because it's coming from the more classical tradition. Even the prog stuff, it's being influenced by chamber music and by orchestral music.
Yeah.
So I liked that stuff, and I liked the stuff that it was influenced by. And remember, I also didn't really like metal. I didn't really like grunge. I didn't like song music, really. Like, I've never been attracted to songcraft. I've been into the the intro to Lark Songs and Aspic Part 3, before the disco beat comes in. That's the part that I liked, So there's this little, elements that I strung together to create my own musical world. And in that world, being instrumental was not like an issue or even a thought, really. It just was like, well, yeah, of course it's instrumental. It was just not even considered.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when I think about it in terms of the context of metal, there were bands like the Champs back then, but they weren't operating in the metal world. They were a metal band, but they were sort of operating in this more, for lack of a better term, indie world.
Yeah, that's the hard thing, is like when I explain to people sometimes, I'm like, well, it's kind of metal, but I guess you guys also kind of get lumped in, and your projects kind of get lumped in with that. Even though it's not like overtly metal, it definitely has influences of it, but I think it's easier just to kind of give that label, maybe.
Sure, exactly. And I mean, I think it's interesting too, if you take the Champs as an example, they're a hell of a lot more metal than any of my bands. I mean, because they're metal in the truest sense. They're like a heavy metal. Like they have the sound of like a Judas Priest or an Iron Maiden. Sure, they have mathy timing, and it's a lot more intricate and less song-based and groove-based and so on. But still, it has that basic sound to it. Whereas, I don't know, I mean, like the early Dysrhythmia stuff, I think, is arguably a little bit less like metal, and then got very rock sort of towards the end of the Clayton era. And then when I came in. It's maybe sort of been gradually getting more metal, and then our last album, I'd say, is our most metal sounding album. Period. So I don't know. Yeah, it's all a question of just how you, what you consider to be in which genre and stuff, and that only really takes you so far.
Yeah.
In terms of like understanding the identity of something.
Well, I know one thing too, especially, you mentioned having a lot of prog influences, and kind of using the music to steer a song more than vocally. I feel like you do that a lot in Krallice, and I'm kind of wondering, maybe take the EP that you just put out last year, for instance. When you guys are writing, what do you kind of choose to serve the song? Where it's like, hey, let's put vocals here, or let's let this all be the instrumental section, because you guys do pretty long songs. So I always feel like the vocals are never too overwhelming. They're exactly where they need to be, if that makes sense. So how do you guys kind of pick and choose those spots to put vocally within the music?
Well, maybe a better question for anybody but me, because I am the least involved in the lyrics and vocals in that band. My only time ever writing lyrics or doing vocals actually is on the EP you just mentioned. It's the last song on that EP, but that's like the first time I've even tried doing that stuff. So everything else, all the lyrics have been written by the other three guys, the drummer included. Okay. And then whether it's Mick singing or McMaster singing, they usually decide where to sing and what the patterns are and so on. And then even we did the collaborative record with Dave from Neurosis, the Laum or Loom or however you want to say it record. Mm-hmm. And for that one too, like we let him decide. We let him write the lyrics. We let him decide where to sing. We might have given him a couple like loose guidelines, but we like leaving it up to the singer basically where to do that.
Okay, so on your end, you have like all the guitar stuff ready to go, and then you just let them kind of take over vocally?
Yeah, and now I'd say maybe in the early days when we were like we just hadn't made as much music, we maybe would just write purely instrumental music and then just put vocals on it. I think over the last decade or so, we've been getting a little more integrated with that, or at least considering it from the beginning. Mick will send me a song he's written, just his guitar, and he'll be like, hey, at 2 minutes and 50 seconds, that's a vocal part. And so I'll know, okay, good. I'm not going to write like a lead over that part. I'm going to maybe keep my guitar part more simple or more integrated with his, or just less out in the open, to make more room for a lead vocal. So in that sense, I guess I'm considering the vocals when I'm writing sometimes. Okay. But for the most part, it's not like, it's the opposite of a singer-songwriter where they like start with the lyrics and the chords, and then they kind of flesh out the arrangement. We like start with the riffs and the structure, and then build the instrumental, and then vocals are definitely like added last. Sometimes we have them in a demo form, and yeah, that's been something that's been gradually over time becoming a little more integrated from the ground up. But yeah, I mean, the thing is too, I think like a lot of the influences that we had when we were starting the band were bands where there was lots of instrumental along with vocal passages. And, that was something that was actually like one of the aspects of the Norwegian second wave black metal stuff that attracted me. Was you'd have like, long section with vocals, but then you'd have like a 3-minute instrumental part in the middle of the song. Or maybe like the song starts and the vocals don't come in for like 4 minutes. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. Like, it seemed so interesting to me. Like, yeah, you don't have to just be instrumental. You can still have vocals, but wow, like at that 4-minute mark when they come in and you haven't heard them yet, it matters more. It feels like there's a reason for it to be there, and not just it's there because it's supposed to be. Yeah,
that's it. Like when you mentioned like having those influences and how you kind of listen to songs, that's what immediately made me think of that, because I was like, man, because it feels like everything's so purposefully kind of mathed out, so to speak, where you're like, yeah, this is where a vocal should go, but it shouldn't be too long or too overwhelming, especially in like a 10-minute long song. Could you imagine just 10 minutes of a vocal over all that? It would take less away from the rest of the instruments when you're really working on those melodies and harmonies and everything in those songs, because sometimes.
Well, I mean, I'll say this too. I mean, I think it's different when you have vocals that are melodic than when you have vocals that are, some form of shouting or screaming. If we were a metal band with a singer like Rob Halford, I think we would just be approaching it in a whole different way. But because, this is just a bunch of yelling, and, I love just a bunch of yelling, but I like giving it that slightly negative spin. You want to use it wisely. And the thing is, it's interesting because it's like a textural element, it's a rhythmic element, but it's not a melodic element. So all the melody, all the harmony is being conveyed by the guitars and, bass being a guitar.
Yeah.
And so, that just kind of maybe changes the way you want to use it. Or at least it does for us. And, I record a lot of bands, and I notice the bands where they haven't really given much thought to the negative space, where the vocals aren't, and the singer will maybe just sing the whole song. And, there's certain styles of music where I think that really fits, like in brutal death metal, the vocals kind of never stop with a lot of bands, and I think it kind of works. But there's a lot of other metal that's very close to that, where it's kind of like, dude, just take a break. Like, it sounds more awesome when you don't sing every eighth note.
Yeah, it's always a fine line, man, and you got to wonder like what's going to serve the song versus like what's going to overwhelm it. And
right.
I mean, it's like every other art. Somebody's going to put in more work than somebody else, and you're going to get a better product out of it. And that's not to say that everybody's not putting in hard work. It's just, I don't know. It's a tough thing because everything's so, everybody's in their own little world, I guess, when they're writing music. I'm sure you're included in that because you have so many different projects going on.
Sure.
Actually, I guess here's a good question for you. How do you kind of extrapolate, hey, this is going to be a Behold song. This may work for Krallice. This may work for Dysrhythmia, Gorguts, whatever, even though you play bass in Gorguts.
Right.
How do you kind of extrapolate those to what you're trying to write for each project?
For me, it's very easy and straightforward. For somebody like Mick from Krallice, who only plays guitar, I mean, he plays a couple other instruments too, but like guitar is his main instrument. Mm-hmm. He just writes riffs on guitar every day. He just is always writing, and he just has this huge bank of riffs and songs at all time. And then he can kind of decide, this is a Krallice song, this is an Acrolim thing. Maybe he has an idea before he sets out, but like anything could kind of be anything. For me, it's the opposite. For one thing, Behold the Arctopus, I play the war guitar. I don't play the guitar or the bass. So that's going to set that apart. Mm-hmm. Gorguts and Dysrhythmia are bass. Although the Gorguts song that I wrote on Colored Sands, I wrote the guitar first. So
oh, wow.
A little bit of gray area there. But I'm setting the different projects apart by what instruments being used to some degree. But then also, I sit down to write songs. I'm not just always writing bits and then I figure out what's what later. Mm-hmm. So I'll actually like sit down and be like, I'm going to make a Krallice song. So I just put myself in that headspace and then that's what it is. And I don't think it ever changes. There was a song that I wrote for Gorguts back in 2012 when I was just sort of too impatient for the Colored Sands to come out. It was a 2-year gap between when we recorded it and when we were able to mix it and finish it.
Wow.
So I wrote an entire song with guitar, bass, and drums. And wasn't sure if everybody liked it that much or thought that it fit. And I remember even at one point Luke suggested, like, you could just use this as an Indragathir song, because I even used the same drum kit that I used for those records to program the demo drums. And I was thinking to myself, like, okay, no, you know what? No, this is a Gorguts song. If we never play it, fine, but it's never going to be another band song. So I guess what that says is that it's always 100% clear to me before I even write a note what it is, who it's for. There's no gray area for me there.
Interesting. Yeah, I love hearing about people's different like workflows with how they do stuff, because I have, I've talked to other guys that are in multiple bands and they're like, I don't know, I'm just always kind of writing different things, and if I feel like it works for this, it works for this, and so on.
I think Kevin's that way too. Kevin Huffnickel, because he's kind of like Mick too. They just both play guitar, and they have lots of projects that they play guitar in. I think even Kevin might have like started working on the the Gorguts song he wrote on Colored Sands. He might have started that as a Dysrhythmia song and then realized it could work for Gorguts, or maybe he's had other stuff that he was writing for Gorguts that became Dysrhythmia. But for me, it's just they're separate, because I do that weird thing where I sort of sit down and force myself to write this or that.
Yeah, that's got to be an interesting kind of project to get involved with too, concerning Gorguts, because I mean, Luke is such the brains behind everything, but the fact that he kind of works at his own pace with everything.
Mm-hmm.
How does that kind of? I kind of read a little bit in your AMA that you're still waiting to like hear back about stuff that you guys are working on, like I guess a year ago or something, if I remember reading correctly.
Not exactly. I mean, I had mentioned that song that I wrote way back when, and then I wrote another song at the end of last year, last September. But knowing the whole time that Luke had already, told me a few times, because I'm every now and then I check and I'm like, hey, what's going on? And he says that he's sort of still in the same place that he's been for the last couple of years, which is just that he wants to write some new material and sort of establish the direction of the new record, and then maybe see if my stuff fits in or not. But I think he's just adamant about setting the tone, and I totally get that. And that's who could be mad at that? That's his band, and I think he should be setting the tone. I mean, that's good.
It's still a cool thing, though.
I'm always of the opinion, like, why not just get together and do something? But that's not his way of working. He likes to. He's very like, I got to get the idea, I got to write the song, start to finish, and then when it's time for him to write lyrics, he's gonna think of some new topic to talk about. He's gonna research it for 2 years. He's gonna read about it, and then he's gonna write his lyrics. So that's how Luke works. And it who can argue? It creates awesome results. I'm just much more, I don't know what the word is. I'm just kind of like, oh, let's work on that. Let's do that. Okay, that's done. All right, now let's work on this. All right, cool, that's done. Let's work on this. I don't know. It's just a whole different, it's a much more New York way of doing things, and much less Quebec.
So I guess, the one thing also I wanted to kind of talk about, since this is kind of more in the forefront of what's going on in terms of the general business, I guess, for lack of a better word. Obviously this virus has put a lot of things to a halt in terms of playing shows, recording, all that stuff. How is that? Have you seen the effects of that yet, like everybody else? Like what's kind of your I guess end game here with dealing with that? Because it seems hard on everybody right now. It's even my friends, they just had a tour canceled and they're 5 figures in debt. It sucks seeing that the art is hurting so much from this.
Absolutely. Yep. I had a tour canceled, just a couple days, a weekend tour, but yep, that was canceled or postponed. We'll see. Mm-hmm. And that is the least of my worries. The biggest worry is that I had studio sessions planned, for the next 3 or 4 months. And so I'm, tens of thousands of dollars out right now. Oh, the good news is that I've been working a lot, so much over the past few months that I have a little bit of a buffer, but, and I also, the good thing is I record people in the studio, but I also do remote work. Mm-hmm. For a band from Europe, for example, maybe they want me to just mix and master their album. So that work can still exist, but even that work is kind of, been halted, because let's say some band in the Czech Republic was going to go record their album and send it to me to mix. Well, now they can't go record it. So that's postponed too. So I just got through most of the remaining remote work that I had, and now I'm coming up to a whole blank month on my calendar. And that's not going to be great. So hopefully this just doesn't last too long, and the business can start up again. Otherwise, I'm dead, totally dead.
Is there anything that you're doing where like people that enjoy your music can like help support you? Because I think that's the important thing here. I know everybody's struggling right now, but I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's good that everybody as a scene kind of comes together and tries to support the art that we all love, and take time out of our day to listen to, and you take time out of your day to create. Are you doing anything like that people can kind of help you out, or you're just kind of in limbo right now?
I mean, for one thing, the canceled work is giving me more time to finish some of my own records.
Cool.
and put those up for sale on Bandcamp. Obviously, that's not really enough money to make a real difference, but it's something, and it does give people a chance to support, and obviously gives them something in return. It's not just a donation. So I'm going to keep doing that, and I'm going to keep doing as much remote work as I can. I actually just got an email or two about some other remote work to do, so it's not going to completely dry up. Mm-hmm. But it's severely compromised, and it's not going to, if it stays this way, I'm totally fucked. But I think it's hopefully not going to stay this way forever. I think that's unlikely. I think things are going to return somewhat to normal. It's going to take longer than anybody wants it to. Yeah. And I'm probably going to lose all the savings that I had finally started saving. So that's very depressing, but like, I can't be too upset because everybody is in the same boat. This is not like, I can't whine about it. This is not like just about me. This is the entire world simultaneously. And that makes me happy because, in a weird way, because this is like the first situation where all of humanity's been dealing with the same thing at the same time. And I feel like that could be huge. That this could be some kind of a turning point where we all kind of come together. Like the cynical side of me is like, no, this is going to totally rip everybody apart in the fabric of society. And, you've got Trump out there being the worst possible influence on people he could be. And so that's all very scary, but who knows? Maybe this is the point where everybody realizes he is the biggest idiot imaginable, and something's going to get done about it. I don't know. I'm excited that the Earth, nature is getting a break from humans. Like nobody's, without people driving as much, there's going to be way less pollution. Yeah. So I don't know. If I really have to think about what's going on critically, there's a lot of good as well. But it just sort of sucks for all the individuals in the moment, myself included.
Yeah, it's interesting because it does seem like everything's on pause, but then you have that small group of people that aren't taking it serious and they're just acting like everything's going to be magically okay. And I don't know. I'm not acting that way myself. It's definitely way more serious than I think a lot of people are taking it. But
that's a troubling. That is a troubling thing, and it's really sad to see people being so selfish.
Yeah, that's exactly what it comes down to, man. It's definitely selfishness. So I guess kind of to go back to the music here, not that we really weren't talking about music, but so you're spread out across all these different kind of bands and genres and musical styles. Besides metal, what kind of influences you outside of that, like movies, books, pop culture stuff? Like, what are you into besides that?
I'm pretty one-dimensional. My life is 99.9% music. So I don't really have any hobbies or anything other than that. Yeah, sure. I like movies and books, and I'm a big sci-fi fan and so on, but I don't think that's a huge influence on my work. That's just stuff that I enjoy. And, in some way, everything's an influence, right? So sure. But for me, it's more that maybe other music is the influence for music, or at this point, maybe not so much even other music, but more just, I don't know what anymore. I mean, it's like the act of creating music for me just gets more and more mysterious. Like, where is this coming from? Why am I deciding to do this? I don't know. I just am making sounds that I want to hear, and creating organizations of sounds that I find interesting. And that's kind of it. I mean, it's that simple.
Yeah. I mean, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. If that is absolutely 100% like what you are happy doing, then that is exactly the kind of thing you should be doing, instead of like wasting, or not even wasting time, doing other things that maybe take up time away from what you want to do.
Yeah. I mean, I look at somebody like my wife, who's incredibly multi-talented. I mean, she's an amazing musician, but she also is an amazing chef, and she makes like perfume and soap from scratch, and can knit, and I don't know. She just has all these. Oh, she does like martial arts. Like, I look at her and I'm kind of like, wow, I I am one-dimensional as fuck, bro. You know, I only do this one thing. But at the same time, it's like I don't really. I feel like the tiny corner of music that I involve myself in with recording and listening and playing is already this infinitely large world that I could just spend the rest of eternity exploring. Mm-hmm. So I don't get that bored of like that world and feel like I want to do something totally different. I just feel like I'm still just scratching the surface of like naughty, instrumental, weird, metallic music. You know what I mean? Like, sure, there's lots of other music I want to make too. I really like making ambient music, and there's all sorts of stuff. But I still feel like that tiny corner is so vast that I sort of feel overwhelmed by even just the small specialization that I have sometimes.
Yeah. So with all the time that you have right now, what are you working on music-wise as far as all your projects or even new stuff or mixing? Like, what have you got coming out?
So the actual like remote work that I just finished up recently was I just reamped and mixed and mastered a new Acrolim for Mick from Krallice.
Nice.
And just mastered the new Thetis album, which is a sort of like technical brutal death metal band from here, some friends of ours. Finished up a solo guitar recording master for Xavier Dubois, Belgian guitarist. The last band I had in the studio was really cool. It was called Spirit Possession, and that's my friend Steve Peacock, who does Mastery and Pandiscordia and Necrogenesis and some really interesting experimental black metal bands. Ulthar is his sort of more traditional death metal band.
Oh, yeah. So that they just put a record out?
Ulthar?
Yeah.
I think he mentioned there was a new one, so I haven't seen if it came out yet. But yeah, if you're saying there's a second one, then that's the one.
Yeah, I've been seeing that name go around, so it must be close or already out.
Cool. Yeah, awesome. But yeah, the Spirit Possession band is a duo of him and Ashley, who used to play drums in Insect Arc, who it's. I don't know. It's like more song-oriented than Mastery. It's not nearly as experimental, but it still has Steve's... he's playing guitar in it, so it has his very unique guitar style, where he plays with no pick and so on. And the chaotic vocals that he's awesome at. So they recorded that at home, and we did like reamping and mixing and mastering here, and they actually came in for it, like, and we're heading back right as the virus thing started to really explode. So that was the last contact with other humans that I've had. And before that, there was a sort of a death metal super group from New York with members of Afterbirth and Buckshot Facelift and Unearthly Trance and Thetis. And they did kind of like a old school death metal with 3 guitars recording here that I finished up last week. And so now I'm actually kind of getting to where I don't have much on the calendar, and I'm going to start getting back to finishing some albums of my own, which I've kind of been hanging for the last couple of years. There's a new Glypto Glossio that's me and Eliane and this drummer Nandor Navai. And we had recorded 2 albums at the same time a couple of years ago, and I finished one of them 2 years ago or last year, and then this one kind of just needs to get finished up. There's a bunch of Vincenithrax stuff to finish. There's a couple songs for the new Krallice album to be finished, and then hopefully in not too long we can get together and record those. And an ambient record that I've been working on with Nick from Krallice.
Nice.
Hopefully we'll finish that up. That's actually going to be pretty cool once that's done, because we have plans to release that not as an album but as a website. So it'll maybe be under Intricatheer and Garyon, I'm not sure what names, but it'll be like a 2.5 hour long stream on this website with maybe accompanying graphics.
Whoa. And
you, instead of putting the album on, you just go to the website and it's wherever it is in the cycle in the 2.5 hour loop. So every time you kind of check in with it, it'll be in a different spot and kind of seem, new. And
That's cool. I've never heard anybody do anything like that. Also,
Yeah,
could
no,
just
it was
be out of touch.
McMaster's idea to do the website, and I thought it was a cool one for something like that. Because I love making these very, very long ambient records, and they're kind of well suited to being on like YouTube or something.
Yep.
But I like the idea that there's no specific start point. It just starts whenever you check it out.
That's a good idea. I like that idea. That's cool.
So yeah, hopefully that'll be on the horizon soon. And yeah, there's a bunch of other stuff, but
Well, it's good you're keeping busy, man. And, you know, that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. You have such an eclectic, like, kind of group of musicians that you work with, and yourself included in all the music that you make. And you know, as much as there's heavy metal influence, I can see and hear all your other non-metal influences in there. And it's nice to kind of get a little bit more behind those.
Sure.
Well, shoot, man, that's all I got. I usually don't like to take more than an hour just because I don't want to take up your whole day here. But
well, man, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, do you do social media or like anything like that where people can follow you, or your bands at least?
All of my bands have Facebook pages, I think.
Cool.
I just recently started actually updating the Behold one myself, but up until then, I had nothing to do with social media. Terrified of it. Still terrified of it, and have no interest in it. But it just makes sense for me to be the person that posts news about Behold. But yeah, I don't have any personal pages or anything like that.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah, I'll link to the bands, and you know, hopefully, I'll just send you the link, and you can share it on whatever social media page if you're able to. If not, I'm sure my listeners.
Oh no,
will
yeah,
find it
no,
too.
for sure. I'll put it up on that one, and then usually I'll just send out stuff like that to the Nick and Kevin and so on, and they'll put it on the other bands' pages.
Cool, man. I'll try and put it up by Friday, and I'll shoot you a link when it's all done.
Awesome. Thanks, Dustin.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. I really appreciate your time, dude.
You too.
All right, have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Be excellent to each other. And party on, dudes!